So there were a few more people I was looking for. Is there anybody in here from the Carcross Tagish First Nations? Okay, so if they do come in, I'll probably greet them. But for now, we'll go ahead and get started. So Dleka Klenach Meda DeWitt Yuchat Doasak Klinget Klenach Zetsinach Yuchat Doasak Nanyaina Chatsati Kachadi Yari Chatsati Shtakin Kwana Yachat. My English name is Meda DeWitt. My Tlingit names are Zetsinach and Klat. My family comes from Wrangell. And we have actually a lot of family in here today. I'm really blessed with my sister, my younger sister, Emily Eden Shah, and Hlagas. Say hello. So he is in his raccoon jammies, and he's ready to take over at any time that I make a mistake. We also have many of the Paul family in the room. We have Cindy DeWitt, which is my auntie. She is my father's sister. And we also have Ben Paul and Nina. That's right, I should know because Nina. So Nina's with us, and I understand that you're a Paul as well. And there's somebody behind you too. Jared, good to meet you. So we have a discussion on Saturday about Tilly Paul Tamari by Ben, correct? So we'll be there for sure. I am here today to talk about behavioral health and climate change. So I am a traditional healer. Many years ago, I started out just with plants and body work and energy work, and entered into the profession of assisting people after my education became a certain degree. And I quickly found out that it was overwhelming because the need was so great. And I was at the point where I was seeing people 6-7 days a week, multiple sessions a day, and burning out from doing the work. And I, at that point, said, I need to clone myself, right? And then I said, no, I don't need to clone myself. We need to find others out there who can do this kind of work and help support people to find out what their gifts are and utilize them to the best ability possible. And so that started a journey many years ago into education and service to community and working in policy. I also want to say hi. We have Dan with us, and he is from, actually,
Presently? From Anchorage presently?
Yes, from Anchorage presently, and he works with UAA Trust Training Cooperative. And so just saying hi to everybody. And he works also with behavioral health, and we deliver traditional health-based practices. I know Vivian Mork from Wrangell. She is a distant cousin, but also as a plant person, she was one of the original people who agreed to help me put on Alaskan Plants as Food and Medicine Symposium. So I was able to organize that with Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium for several years and help the community come together and realize, yes, there are other plant people, and yes, our knowledge is alive, and yes, we are ready to share and move forward in healing. So as we go forward and seeing what is out of balance, you start digging into these systems. And from a Tlingit framework, our balance is also intrinsically entwined with the environment and nature and our communities. So where is our resiliency? We're finding our resiliency in a changing world. So science is finally catching up with what northern indigenous peoples have observed for many years. Our climate is changing rapidly, and we heard stories from Vivian earlier about these changes and these experiences. And they're impacting our behavioral health, and it's increasing as the climate change increases itself. It increases emotional stress, anxiety, trauma, grief, and loss. Some villages have already begun to relocate. Jacqueline Estes spoke about that this morning in her talk about Alaska Native people and climate change. And of course, we saw some of the more dramatic experiences of people up north who live along the rivers and on the coast. But the water is rising, right? It's affecting all of us, and it's affecting us in different levels of impact. And we actually have projected. Okay, Yeah, no, as she told me not to get too close to it. I was trying not to. Okay, thank you. Is this better? Okay. I'm sorry about that. So we can learn about from our northern indigenous peoples, including us, right, and our relatives who have lived here and adapted to changing climates in the past. So I have a really text-heavy presentation, and I know they're supposed to be all pictures, but what I want is people to be able to take away this PDF for later use. And so because I teach distance education, I've found that just having it written so people can take it with them is the best way. Okay. So one of the elders that I work with on a regular basis up in the Anchorage area and around the state is Athabascan Elder Wilson Justin. And we were having this conversation about when climate change started. And, we were talking about, well, if they knew about it in the 80s and they knew about it in the 60s and they knew about it, in these different scenarios. And he says, no. He says, climate change started at contact because that's when our relationship with the environment was disrupted and put out of balance. And I was like, yes, you're right. Thank you, Elder. So as Indigenous people, we know that those invisible lines, right, they do not change who we are. We are related across the borders. And we have Tlingit people, if you look at the dark yellow here, of course, in Southeast and inland. So the Tlingit people have this relationship through trade routes to the interior, to our brothers and sisters and fellow clansmen. And through those trade routes, we have thousands of miles of grease trails that we use to harvest high-grade marine oils and trade them inland with people and distribution. We also had distribution throughout this, down the West Coast and in the Pacific Ocean. So Alaska, I don't know if most of us already know this, but not everybody knows this, is the largest state of the Union, but we also account for about 20% of the total land mass of the United States. We also have twice as much coastline as the lower 48. And we are experiencing climate change up here in the north much quicker than they are in the lower 48. So we also have diverse range of ecosystems that include, boreal forests. We also have rainforests and glaciers. We have tundra and meadows. And we also contain 16 national wildlife refuges that span over 76 million acres. That's 60% of the total area managed by the National Park Service up here in Alaska, right? Again, here's another representation of a little bit zoomed in of Tlingit, where we have villages and communities all the way up, Icy Bay next to the Copper River, all the way down next to Haida Gwaii, and inland to our Deslin Kwan peoples. We also have Atland and Carcross of Tlingit people inland. So our identity is firmly rooted in being raised in the environment with stories and lineage of relationship. It is an extension of ourself, right? Our environment is an extension of our community, our culture, and worldview. And it becomes a primary teacher and connector to spirituality and creating a sense of place and purpose. So we used to spend a considerable more time out on the land, and we tested ourselves against the environment. So for young men's rites of passage, right, they had to go and hike up over the mountain and back, or they had to spend time out in the woods. Our medicine people would have to vision and spend time out in the woods. So that's a place where we went to test ourselves and see where our limitations are. And if you ever have teenage boys, you realize how smart that actually is. This is actually from one of the other clan conferences attended before, and display of the robes. Okay. So North America, right? This is the first frontier of climate change. They're always calling us the last frontier for this or the last frontier for that. And we are actually at the frontier, the first frontier, the border of and facing this, correct? So here is some information from the EPA before it was scrubbed from the internet recently. Last couple of years. So over the past 60 years, the average temperature across Alaska has increased approximately 3 degrees Fahrenheit. This increase is more than twice the warming seen in the rest of the United States, so double, right? Warming in the winter has increased by an average of 6 degrees and has led to changes in ecosystems such as earlier breakup, and we saw some of that this morning with Jocelyn, and earlier springs. As the climate continues to warm, the average temperatures in Alaska are projected to increase additional 2 to 4 degrees by the middle of the century. Now, since this research is done, they've found that it's accelerating, right? It's going faster. And if we start to talk about some of our elder stories or traditional stories, we have stories of elders saying Alaska is going to be warm again, right? They knew that, and we hear this, and they've told us about this. Also, the acceleration. There's some of these traditional knowledges or traditional items that get translated that sometimes they sound kind of funky until you start to experience them, right? And one of them is time is going faster. And in Western mind, you look at your watch and you're like, no, it's not. And they're like, oh, the atomic clock, it lost a microsecond over the last 100 years. And it's like, yeah, no. So you have to think of what is time. So traditional context of time is seasonality, right? So winter, spring, summer, fall, time for harvesting fish, time for harvesting roots, time for, these things that we do. So that's the sense of time that we're referencing. So when we say this time is speeding up, what they're speaking to is a Western mind that has no clue of the absolute genius of our elders and traditional knowledge. And what they were speaking to was this rapidly accelerating climate change where our seasons are going to go faster and faster and faster until they spin out of control, right? It's not the Greenwich Mean Time. So we had under Walker, we had Val Davidson as Health and Human Services Director, and this was released January 8th of 2018. I'm really glad that they got it out. So it's an assessment of the health impacts and climate change in Alaska. And again, this translates across the border, right? So this also translates in the boreal forest, so our brothers and sisters that are just inland. So mental health and stress-related disorders are important health outcomes that are influenced by climate change. And for example, climate change can affect mental health by causing solesthesia. So solesthesia is a sense of loss that people experience as a result of unwanted environmental changes and associated pathologies such as anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. These can all result from acute events such as fires, floods, and storm surges, as well as more protracted changes such as thawing of permafrost and coastal erosion. Excuse me. Did you have your hand up? Oh, okay. Sorry, I just caught out of my peripheral vision. So mental health and well-being, right? So we have these impacts of solesthesia, and also I heard it referred to as environmental grief or climate change grief on the radio the other day. It's leading cutting edge, right? And so here we are as Indigenous people, and we've been talking about this ever since I entered into the collegiate system, right, or educational system of listening to elders. They've been warning us about this. So over 20 years, elders have been telling us that this is happening. But just the other day, cutting edge research on NPR talking about the mental health effects of climate change. So disproportionate impact of those living in low resource settings, including Indigenous groups, right? So this influences interpersonal violence, community conflict, and can impact mental health and well-being through changes in factors such as family structures, economic status, and cultural continuity. So it actually says disruption of cultural continuity causes these mental health effects. So we actually have some truth coming out in these statements that we've been looking for a long time. We've been wanting government to be accountable for relocation, right? For extractive resources, for doing what they did with the commercial canneries to our fishing systems. And so now we have truth on paper because it's affecting greater volumes of people, right? It's not affecting the minority anymore, it's affecting the majority. It can't be hidden any longer. So the psychosocial distress and associated health outcomes may increase among emergency workers and first responders as well. They are, these workers respond to disasters involving death and injury and work in stressful environments, which put them at risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and panic disorders, and as we know it, caregiver burnout. So residents have expressed concern and feeling of depression related to the uncertainty of the scope and magnitude of potential climate change because they don't know how far it's going to go. But traditionally, we know, right? It's going to go all the way. There's no going back to a regular seasonality that we had before. We are going to be warm again. So residents have expressed anxiety about potential impacts of climate change on culture, subsistence resources, traditional knowledge, ways of knowing, infrastructure damage, the economy, community relocation, cultural burial sites, recreational activities, future generations, and the Alaskan way of life. Increased wildfires and droughts in the Yukon and British Columbia and Alaska, right? Decreased glaciers, snowpack, and increased precipitation. So we have seen throughout the state what's happening in Shishmaref and Newtok and those kinds of areas, but now we're seeing what's happening here, right? We had droughts in places that's a rainforest, highest rainfall, in most North America. And so we experienced droughts, and inland with the boreal forest, there was extreme fires, and we had record-breaking temperatures. And so we are losing our glaciers and our snowpack at a degree that they didn't think we were going to see for another 30 years, 50 years. But because we're accelerating the seasonality, right, or cycles or time, we're seeing them faster and faster and faster. And when I heard David Attenborough earlier this year at Davos say, we have, 12 years left to actually, mitigate this problem so that way we don't go extinct. And I'm like, it's getting closer. We actually have 7 years left. So there may be continued impacts on mental health, community wellness, family structure, and maladaptive coping behaviors, such as alcohol use, substance abuse, and suicidality. Psychosocial distress and stress and anxiety that arise over factors such as economic issues, relocation, and uncertainty over infrastructure stability has already increased among residents. Psychosocial distress and its associated comorbidities is predicted to continue to increase as communities relocate. Relocation becomes more eminent, right? So the mental illness could be increased, right, because of factors such as decreased food security, damaged infrastructure, economic costs, water quality concerns, and extreme storm events. Now, the extreme storm events are going to increase. We saw a few years ago, right, the landslide in Sitka that had the mountainside slough off with the trees. And we're actually, as a state, we are going to see more drought, but precipitation is actually going to increase. So that means these high flood events are going to increase in number. And it's not just us, right? It's also inland. So our headwaters for the Yukon start in Carcross, right? The headwaters for the Stikine go up Telegraph Creek and start inland as well in BC. So we're all connected, right? Because we're all connected through Hlinga Ani. There's no difference between us. So nearly 90% of Alaska Native communities are located on the coast. The United States Army Corps of Engineers determined that 183 of the 213 communities are going to have to move. The threat and process of community relocation is stressful for residents and could result in a variety of adverse health outcomes related to psychosocial distress. I don't think people realize this number, right? And as Tlingit people, where do we build? We always build just above high tide, right? So that means, this was 2013 and 2011. They've known that long, but things haven't gotten out to people, right? That we haven't had enough truth tellers in office to release this information. So subsistence, right? So subsistence has a lot of different terms. It's the state of Alaska says it's the non-commercial and customary traditional uses of wild renewable resources by residents domiciled in rural area, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Alaska Federation of Natives describes subsistence as the hunting, fishing, and gathering activities which traditionally constitute the economic base of life, right, for Alaska Native peoples, which continue to flourish in many areas of today. Simply, it is ha-kus-ti, right? It's our way of life. It's who we are as humans. Yechayeti. So the things in food and nutrition, because it is all about food, right? We love our food and we respect our food. It's nations, right? It's not just for consumption. It's the nations that we are in relationship with because we are completely dependent upon them. So we are going to see rising food prices, challenges to food quality and quantity, and changing food distribution patterns. Due to specialized dietary patterns in Alaska with heavy reliance on subsistence resources, changes to key food sources could lead to food insecurity and associated health costs. We already saw this summer about the impacts of heat on salmon. There was large salmon die-offs. Why? Because they were having a heart attack because the water was too warm. So we already have communities reporting various changes to subsistence harvests. Like I said, salmon die-off, warmer ocean waters, shifting caribou migrations. I know that Carcross has not done a traditional caribou hunt in 20 years because they wanted the herd to rebuild itself. And it's still not to a point of enough numbers to go and hunt. And so this is something that the elders talk about regularly, that there's whole generations that have not done a traditional caribou hunt, which is part of their rites of passage into being an adult and contributing member of the community. So we've already seen these disruptions. There's a northward shift in seals and fish species, thinning ice and river ice. Many of our inland communities use river travel in the winter, and it's now become destabilized. It also makes it more challenging harvesting wild foods and more precarious. So we're seeing more accidents out on the land due to unstable ice or overflow. We have increasing ocean temperatures and permafrost changes that alter spring runoff patterns. So we have the stability of water access that's going to go away, right? Because our water used to be held up in permafrost, in snowpack, in glaciers, and the ground was colder in some areas, especially when you start going north. The permafrost helps to keep the water in the ground, and when it melts, it creates underground rivers that flow out to the ocean. If these changes continue to occur, the consumption of local food sources might decrease, though consumption of some local food sources could increase if species move into a new area, right? So we're seeing places up north where the willows used to be this tall are now this tall, and then moose move into that area, right? Yes?
We have a huge amount of squid coming into the Gulf of Alaska. It's
Oh.
almost at commercial levels at this point.
Good thing they taste good.
And fried.
Excellent. Thank you. So did you everybody hear that? Increased squid into the Gulf Coast, almost to the point of commercial use. Okay, so addressing climate change, right? That was a whole lot of intense information that's really hard to deal with. I think that it's important to accept it as truth, right? And we'll go through the cycles of acceptance here in a minute. But addressing climate change as a public health issue is very important for us to move forward. So public health perspectives on climate change. Scientists, clinicians, and public health professionals have called for attention to climate change in both practical and ethical grounds. Primary prevention corresponds to mitigation, right? The efforts to slow, stabilize, or reverse climate change. And secondary and tertiary prevention corresponds to adaptation. Efforts to anticipate and prepare for the effects of climate change, and thereby to reduce the associated health burden. As Shinga people, adaptation is something that we know about, eh? Okay. So in this recipe to address this as a public health issue, they say monitor health status to identify and solve community health problems. So information is key to responsive and functioning systems. To respond to climate change, several categories of data have to emerge. So environmental risks, vulnerability, and disease. Understanding what are the actual impacts that we have to deal with. Diagnose and investigate health problems and hazards in the community. So identifying, investigating, and explaining health problems at the population level, and determining the extent to which health problems can attribute to climate change. Because not everything, we can't blame everything on climate change, right? So inform, educate, and empower people on the health issues. We have to tell people the truth. We can no longer pretend that it's not going to happen or it's not going to be that bad. Right? We are literally faced with an extinction event. And the good news is we still have time to do something about it. So we have to empower people to access and use necessary health resources. Also on NPR the other day, the thing that stuck with me in the presentation of their research in the Arctic in Canada was that they found out that action feels better than anxiety. That was one of their outcomes. I was like, okay, I can agree with that. I'll use that. And so they found that communities, and for the most part, people actually know that it's real. People know that it's happening, but people don't know what to do about it. And for the people who, have already changed their light bulbs, right, and they recycle, and they don't eat meat one day a week, and they've kind of, there's been like these little lists of things that you can do. And so that does help to a degree, but the action that we need is at a larger scale. And the researchers actually said that getting involved in climate justice was therapeutic beyond prescription. So they decided not to make this a prescriptive, climate change, grief, and solasthesia was not something that you would prescribe medicine for. You would tell people to get engaged. I was like, all right, I like these researchers. I'll keep them around. We'll stick them in the PowerPoint. So mobilizing community partnerships to identify and solve health problems. Multi-level, interdisciplinary, and integrated response partnerships among federal, state, and local government agencies, academia, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector. It literally is going to take all of us coming together and working together as a group to make it through this. Develop policies and plans that support individual and community efforts. Health input is appropriate in at least two ways. First, health professionals can explain the health rationale for climate change mitigation in terms of reduced morbidity and mortality. So they're giving you the words for the grants. Okay, they're giving you, because if anybody's written grants, you always have to have the special words. So here's the words. Second, health scientists can provide evidence on health impacts of various approaches to climate change mitigation, including co-benefits and disbenefits. The health sector should play a major role in developing plans that address health threats related to climate change. Enforce laws and regulations that protect health and ensure safety. Public health can provide science-based input regarding laws and regulations in the environmental, transportation, and energy arenas. I like that, energy arenas. Start using that hard data, hard science, and making energy policy based on that. Policies are codified. There may be roles for state and local public health agencies in enforcing such policies as building codes, water quality regulations, and air quality laws. So it is all about water, right? Water is life. And what I've heard from our elders is that we're going to have so much water, we won't even know what to do with it, right? Water levels, sea level is going to rise, and it's going to be like water world, because we aren't going to have it locked up in ice sheets and ice caps and icebergs and glaciers. It won't be locked up. It'll be in the environment. The trick is access to clean water, because the Western system likes to build industry and trade at sea level or port, right? Port entries or spaces. So as sea level rises, and as our, look at the Bahamas and the hurricane that they just had that totally leveled entire communities. So what happens is there's a significant environmental impact with toxins when those events occur. So if we have industry and fuel tankers and all of that at port areas with increased sea level and increased storms that occur in those areas, we have higher events of pollution in our water systems. Okay? So we should actually be reducing what is at stake, those things that can pollute our water systems. We need to be moving them away from shorelines, away from coastal areas, shutting down, nuclear power plants that are on the coastal area and moving them in, or just not rebuilding them at all. So, link people to needed health services and ensure provision of care. Develop local, regional, and national emergency medical systems and enhance their disaster response capacity, including specialized services and surge capacity. So we heard earlier that there was 600 firefighters, right, fighting the Swan Lake fire. I was in the presentation this morning. We were importing firefighters from all over. We also have, these events that require larger capacity. So it used to be we'd have a national disaster every few years, right? It didn't happen every year. Now we're seeing more than one a year occur. So we need to actually increase our capacity. Mental health burden following acute disasters is considerable, especially for high-risk groups such as children. In addition, the long-term stresses of climate change, living with uncertainty, environmental threats, and alterations in familiar habitats and habits may impose chronic mental health burden on our children and people. The health system needs a capacity for rapid needs assessment, mental health service delivery, and long-term follow-up. So ensure a competent public and personal health care workforce. A trained and competent workforce is central to the success of a health system, right? So that we were talking about, we need to increase capacity. We need medical care providers who can recognize and respond to the threats. It is critical to develop the systems now while we still have the capacity to do so. And evaluate effectiveness, accessibility, and quality of services. So the evaluation of preparedness plans, health communication strategies, and other initiatives not only help improve public health, but it can also facilitate communication with key community stakeholders. Okay, so that is a lot of the Western system, right, coming over to us. And then here's more of what I've learned from elders and community members, right? So strengthening community by supporting community strengths. So what is trauma, right? So for the most part, trauma is a stress that is unmitigated, right? So if you have a situation that you are able to take control of, then that event is highly stressful, but it's not traumatic. If you have a situation that you are not able to take control of, then it can turn into a traumatic experience, right? So that sovereignty or governance of self is one of the key factors of what is a trauma. So historical trauma is the total, collective, and emotional psychological wounding over lifespans and across generations, stemming from massive group trauma. Either acute or chronic occurrences can cause historical trauma. Intergenerational trauma are the wounds caused in new generations from the trauma past generations still carry. These wounds are passed down in a cyclical fashion through displayed behaviors and attitudes, also handed down through epigenetics and cellular memory. So our elders used to say, right, you can hand down memory, blood memory, to our children. And we had protocols of how to behave when you were pregnant, how to behave at conception, how to behave around children. And those behaviors get coded or imprinted into the children. And so it's really important that we realize that happens. So epigenetics are the codes around the genetic material that turn on or off, that tells a gene whether or not to express. Now, what is the good news about epigenetics? We can actually go the other way too. We can heal them as well. Okay. So persisting trauma is social, economical, institutional, judicial, or other extenuating factors that perpetuate effects of historical or generational trauma, creating environmental triggers and reinforcement of original traumatic impacts. So colonization, assimilation, right? We have situations where the Papist Bull that was written in the 1400s by Pope Nicholas V that allowed the king to manifest destiny in the rule of sword, doctrine of discovery. So anybody who is non-Christian was not human and was allowed you basically could enslave them and take their land from them, is what that document said. Now that, and you could kill them. Well, everybody else took it too. Yeah.
But they had to bless it, whatever.
Yeah.
They could kill them, but that was part of the
Yep.
papal bull.
Yeah, so they could kill them, they could enslave them, and they were not given rights as human beings. Yeah. So this doctrine of discovery, actually in the 1800s, or the Papist Bull, was used in Indian law for the Supreme Court in the United States. So that spirit of that document still lives in the laws and policies and institutions that we deal with today. All right. Okay, so we also have situations of persisting trauma such as, lateral violence or internalized racism, prejudices, lots of different examples. Oh, I already had that slide in there and I already explained it a little bit. So stress is a response to act, either good or bad. Planning a birthday party, right, or getting into a car accident, they both elicit stress responses. So trauma occurs when you're not able to mitigate or cope with the stressors. Prolonged exposure to stress changes the physical, mental, and spiritual aspects of a person. With enough intensity or duration of the stressor can even change how genes express epigenetics, right? And so one of the important keys here of this is our story. What is our story? Knowing who we are and where we come from. Because if you don't have the story that goes with the trauma, then it's harder to identify what is actually happening. And they end up it being like ghosts in the system that you're trying to debug. So cycles of acceptance, we talked about this earlier. Nobody really wants to accept that climate change is real, right? That's scary. It's terrible. Like it causes people when they first, and this is a cycle I've seen over the years, when they first realize how bad it is and what the truth is, there's usually a major depression and a drop of hopelessness, right? And so it's been my experience over the years to get people past that drop and into, we can do something about this, we have to change, right? And so hearing that on the radio, that action is better than anxiety is right on. That's exactly what we need to do. So we have this cycle of acceptance, normal existence, right? And then bad news, we deny it. And then it makes us angry because we don't want to accept it. So you get anger. And America has some anger issues about climate change right now, right? We've got some issues going on. Even pulling out of like the Paris Climate Agreement and backpedaling. Right now, as a country, we're in a healing crisis. And you could almost project these swings of belief and denial in accordance with behavioral health, the scales of grief and healing. So then we have aggression over the situation, and then depression and confusion and bargaining, right? And then finally acceptance. And so we have to get through this cycle and realize that when people are angry about it or denying it, that they're actually in the process. It's a normal human way of dealing with things. As a country or as people?
Stick with Alaska.
Right. Well, Alaska actually has higher levels of acceptance that climate change is real because our experience of climate change is much greater, right? So just listening to people in the community, there's only the few over here, like 30%, 20% that actually want to believe that it's not real. Yes.
There's believing that it's real, but believing that it's human caused. Real.
Yeah.
What's your take on that in Alaska?
Well, it depends. So, for the most part, people realize that humans have influenced it. It's hard though, because as Alaskans, our impact on the greater scale is much smaller, right? So how we impact the environment versus other places, we could do everything perfectly. And if the rest of the US and Canada aren't on board, then it's not going to make enough of a difference, right? So there is especially when you're talking to some elders will say, but the climate has always changed, right? And then we talked earlier, I don't know if you were here, about the acceleration of time and seasonality. So that's where we're at, is we have this acceleration of seasons and time, which is not normal compared to past transitions. And so that's what we've done, is our imbalanced relationship to the environment has caused that acceleration of this process. Okay, so traditional resiliency strategies that have worked for over 10,000 years, right? We're person and community centered. We're culturally relevant. We're place-based, seasonally lined, holistic and inclusive, and we are adaptive. So first, primary concept, spirituality, gives us purpose, a sense of place, and connection to creation. It tells us how we fit into the grand matrix of creation. What is our purpose? Community support networks. That was a foundational part of our culture. Traditional education and mediation, right? We have incredibly intrinsic protocols on how to be in relationship with each other appropriately to And one of the traditional values that I think gets mixed up is that conflict avoidance. It's not, we don't avoid something that's hard. Conflict avoidance actually should have been translated into being proactive, right? Seeing a conflict in the future and then working to mitigate it before it becomes an issue. So that's actually that traditional value and how it should be interpreted. And then, of course, we have to have adequate water and food and medicine. And that is a direct relationship. We are dependent on the environment for those things. People don't realize that the prescriptive medicines, over 70% of them actually come from indigenous plant uses worldwide. And you can look up Dr. Chris Kavlin from Australia, his PhD in law and traditional healing, to reference that. So our traditional songs, dance, and drumming, right? Those have medicine in them for our spirit. Storytelling and worldview. Storytelling is our transmission of knowledge, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. I'm getting ahead of myself. So hunting and fishing and gathering and growing. Tlingit people did cultivate plants pre-contact. We did grow things. It just doesn't look the same as the agrarian sense. We also cultivated natural habitats and environments to augment and increase abundance. And we have stories of our elders talking about how the fish were so big and so thick in the rivers, you could walk across the rivers, right, when they're swimming up to spawn. So sharing and our games and competitions, building and creating. And within that sense of what is our homes inland and on the coast, they were built from the materials and what was available in those areas, right? They were always sustainable. And traditional healers and medicine people and ceremony. And this is important for us to come to this point to bring those traditions back. Part of colonization and assimilation, one of the very specific tactics that was employed was removal of the medicine person from the community. Because what they found is they could not get communities to bend or submit until the medicine person either converted or was removed. So we have situations, like up north, where the medicine people had to give up their tools and convert before the missionaries would release vaccines, right? We have stories in Tlingit Ani of, medicine people going missing or being murdered. We also have understanding from the Hopi, 19 of their medicine people were taken from the Hopi Nation and put in Alcatraz because they wouldn't let them take the kids to boarding schools. And once they took the medicine people and put them in Alcatraz, they removed the children from the Hopi Nation, right? So part of us coming back into balance is reinvigorating and bringing back traditional healing and medicine practices and ceremony. Yes.
I think it's wonderful that you've captured those qualities that have led to our resiliency as a people.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of it too is overcoming the fragmentation that was put on us because of colonization and American laws.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of this speaks to being able to work together, either
Yes.
as a family, as a
Yes.
clan, as a Kwan. And sadly, with colonization, we've become a very fragmented people. So I think part of the journey is becoming that community again.
Yes. And working with medicine people from all over Alaska, from the Northwest Territories in Canada, and even in Lower 48, that their stories and all the stories come back to being a solid community, supporting each other, and protecting Mother Earth. That's the recipe that we need to transition and actually survive and then thrive again. Thank you.
After that, I keep going to thinking about that. 86% of people will have to relocate due to flooding and erosion.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to the question the lady behind us had about people's level of coping skills are going to be different in the different regions of Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, that's a real eye-opener to me, that rate is so high.
Yeah.
They're just surviving.
Yeah, and so this is why we have to get into the traditional context to do this well, right? Because it's hard enough. We have disparities at higher levels than other places to begin with, right? And so once you start having to move and relocate and bring in the climate change, behavioral health aspects, then it's like a pressure cooker for everybody, and right? So then what we have to do is we have to look to culture, right, for the answer, because we're not going to find it in the other spaces. So thank you. So we're going to go ahead and keep going so that I don't run out of time, and then we can ask more questions afterwards. So language is tied to the land. It's a harmonic representation of the relationship between people and the ecosystem. Traditional knowledge, history, and science is woven into our language, right? Our place names tell us what we did when in those areas, or have stories associated with them to understand how to be in relationship with that space. So English is a trade language. It's tied to barter and commerce. So its soul, right, is money. Traditional languages are needed to heal. We also need to understand them to understand ha kustii. We have to have our language to understand how to be in relationship with the environment again. Storytelling is an essential part of our culture as Northern Indigenous people, and frankly, humans, right? So pre-contact, everybody had stories that were ancient stories. But as Tlingit people, that's part of who we are, our oral traditions, our legendary stories. We have stories that are 10s, 20,000 years, if not older. That's who we are. So it's a powerful tool to talk about challenging situations and how they are handled. Some of the stories are told about our history or clan and cultural groups, and they're required to be told in a certain way, and you have to have the authority and permission to tell these stories. We have legends and epic mythology that explain our cosmology and worldview. These stories I love these ones because you have this frontal cortex that likes to figure things out, right? It wants to figure things out if it's true or not true. And if you go into the land of legend, right, you bypass the newer brain and get into the older brain, and you start talking to the subconscious. And you can forego the process of trying to figure out if you're telling the truth or not, right? You automatically get to go into the story and exist in that time and space. We also have stories about normal people and how they handle situations, sometimes good and sometimes not so good. Usually they're horrible, right? They're calamitous, and we can learn what not to do by the folly of the person in the story. And so these are important in helping to develop our sense and identity and expected behaviors in the community. Oh, okay. So migration stories, right? The Tlingit people have oral stories that recount difficult situations that have become classified as that could have become classified as historical traumas. But do we talk about our migration stories as a historical trauma? No, we don't. We talk about them as our stories of strength, right? And survival. And that's what brought us to the coast, to be coastal Tlingit people. It's who we are. So the difference in these stories, right, the strength and the resiliency, and the difference between this and a historical trauma is that we are able to have sovereignty. In these stories, we choose to move, right? And in that moving process, we grieve the land that we are living in. And we do ceremony and we say goodbye. And then we take that leap of courage and we go into the unknown and trust that Creator and the environment and community will take care of us in the process. So we need to have that ability to move through sovereignty and self-determination to move forward into the future. Our stories are associated with geological time. We have gone through climate change before, right? We have seen challenges on this level before. And we actually know what the process or the recipe is to make it through them. And it's time to take back our story. So, World Health Organization, the mental health is an individual realizes his or her own ability. As a community, we do this. We teach people how to be Shinga or how to be human. And we give them spaces and opportunities to test themselves, right? To show that they're good hunters, or to show that they can survive on their own in the wilds, or to build, amazing things. Also, can cope with normal stresses of life. Within our stories, we talk about what are coping strategies. And as you were talking about earlier, traditional resiliency strategies, right? Those are all positive coping mechanisms as well. And can work productively and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So all of this, when you start looking at traditional framework of culture, fits within this. It is the best positive sense of well-being and mental health. So relationship to the environment, and we said this in the beginning. When we're raised in the environment with stories and lineage and relationship, the environment becomes an extension of yourself. Community, culture, and worldview. The environment becomes a primary teacher and connector to spirituality and creating a sense of place and purpose. So, teens and young adults, right? This is where some of the magic happens, okay? So in traditional indigenous cultures, teens are supposed to be waymakers. They're supposed to test the system. They're supposed to find new ways to do things. Elders and communities looked to that age group to inform and improve the way things are done. And they have so much energy, right? Hormones and strength, and they can't help it, they break stuff, right? And if they do, then that is a challenge for us or a community on how to make things better, right? Also, teens they're structuring in their brain their identity and their character, and they're looking for incongruences. They're looking for hypocrisies. That's part of who they are. And so that used to be a strength of a community. So innovation and wisdom, right? That's our way forward. Our youth and our elders, that's the way forward. Tech and tech, right? So using the best that we have available to us is actually a cultural value. If we found out a better way to do things, we did it, right? That's who we are. So here are some of the things to think about on moving forward. We have to clean up, right? So traditionally, when we were getting ready to move through the village, we had to go through the process of saying goodbye. So and this is so Tlingit, we have to prepare for a good death. That's what we have to do. Because the ways that we have been doing things as a society and Earth, they're going to die. And we can choose to move forward or we can die with them, right? So how do we live? We live by letting go. We live by giving gratitude for all of the learning and understanding that we've just been through. We have to clean up emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, and clean up the environment. We have to create sustainable and renewable energy systems. Now, sustainable means keeping things the same. And that's not how we used to do things. We didn't keep things the same. We allowed them to increase in abundance. We figured out how systems work, what the natural laws were, And that's our traditional ecological knowledge, right? Natural laws, how to be in relationship. And you use those to create abundance beyond what we need. So there needs to be abundance of fresh water, not just for ourselves, but for the salmon nation as well, right? So we have to embrace new and old, like we just talked about with our teens and our elders, and have the highest ethical materials and manufacturing standards possible. We don't have to make plastic out of petroleum anymore. You can use hemp, and then it biodegrades and turns in, you can compost it, right? There's no reason to continue to use things that no longer serve us. We have to have education based on Indigenous peoples' understanding of the land, the world, and how to be in community. In our world, we are no longer separated from other peoples, right? Our communities are integrated, our families are integrated. We have multicultural identities, and we can't leave one segment behind, right? If we have one part of the community that suffers, we all suffer. So commerce that is tied to community-focused local production, trade, and tradespeople. We have to meet the basic needs of our community. So understanding of a traditional chief, right? What was their duty? Their duty is community wellness, is community balance, is community abundance. So a community, if we were traveling together, we would only be as strong as our weakest person. We would only be as fast as our slowest person, right? So what if we looked at Alaska and the US and Canada and we judged them by the suffering of the most vulnerable, how do we rate? Bad. We're not the leader in the world, we're like the worst, right? So food, water, medicine, clothing, and shelter for all people is what we have to do as a human right. Just because you are human, you are valuable and deserve to be loved and cared for. So who are we? We are the legendary ancestors. We are in the midst of an epic migration story. Do you realize that? Yeah. We are in the middle of it. And time, our seasonality, it's moving faster. And it's time to come together as community, and it's time to stand up for Mother Earth. Ganesh Chish, Ganesh Chish, Ganesh Chish, Hasha KTOO. Before we transition to the next speaker.
Lots of questions.
All right.
So, Native communities were decimated over the period of time between around 1800 and the influenza epidemics of the 1919, around there, circa or so, where whole communities were wiped out. Complete villages gone. And but many villages would have 60, 70, 80% of individuals. And so the belief in the traditional healing capability of a Native community was eliminated. It just was not believed in any longer. And when you've lost everybody that God, I'm getting emotional.
That's okay. You are saying that, and it's a real story.
I'll calm down eventually.
No, cry. Go for it. We'll cry with you.
And you've lost everybody in your family. And you are just the survivor. And learn that there's nobody you can trust. There's no family member left. And there is maybe some other folks in your community that are still there, but they're in the same condition you are. And very often their source of food and places to sleep have been robbed from them. I mean, this is a community that is amazing that it's still standing. And over my lifetime, jeez. Over my lifetime, it has resurged tremendously. And that communities are being rebuilt, traditional values are being observed and believed in, and that the medical aspects of what used to be have morphed into something new that is belief in white man medicine and traditional medicine and community, and it's become something different. And God, I had a question for you.
You've been listening to his big brother too long.
About all that, and that, I mean, that is a perspective that just dominates the Indian culture, and the loss of belief in Native institutions, and that I've seen in my time whole communities that the last thing that they wanted to be was Indian, and they wanted to be white. They wanted to be anything but Indian as a young man. This is what I observed. And now I observe the opposite of that. That is a proud thing. And
that's worth saying, yes.
Yeah. So we share relatives. We're descendants of Tilly Paul Tamaree and Louis Paul and William Paul. And my grandmother is Meda DeWitt Paul. And my grandfather taught me about plants as I was a kid, and I lived in subsistence lifestyle as a child in Hollis and Kloak. And of course, when I was a teenager, right, and moved to an urban center, I didn't want to do that or be that any longer. And so I fought against it for a period of time. And my grandmother lived with me in my early 20s. And, at one point, I found that I wanted that again. I wanted those things again, right? I wanted to be whole. And I wasn't given a whole, right, culture or a whole thing. And so I said, Grandma, I don't think I'm Native enough. I don't have enough Native art and clothes, and I'm not brown enough. And she just says, oh, honey, she's really sweet. And she was like, 5'2". She said, oh, and so she proceeded to tell me, because when she was little, when she was 4, she had TB. And there's a longer story to that, but basically Tilly Paul and little grandma used Western medicine and traditional medicine to heal her and her mother of TB. Okay. And so she lived with Charlie quite a bit and with Tilly quite a bit because she was so little and she was underweight. And she said, your grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents spent their entire lives fighting for the right to be Native, right? Their entire lives were dedicated to fighting for the right to be Native. And she said, in the end, their only lament was they gave up too much in the process. She said, now it's just your job to go out and enjoy being Native and understand what it means to be Native, right? So that's where we are. We are in the pursuit, and that's my nephew, Lagas, whose mother is my sister, who is Anita Shah and has her master's in Haida language and culture, right? So now it is our job to understand what it means to be Native and to love being Native and to move forward and teach our generations. And that's how we heal. Ah.